A lone veteran lies pinned under a massive timber at the bottom of a frozen ravine. The temperature is dropping to 20 degrees below zero. In his pocket, a tiny puppy shivers for warmth. Above the ridge, a hungry coyote pack begins its descent into the dark. As his vision fades, the old man whistles a melody meant for the dead. Will this ghost of a tune be enough to summon a miracle? Can a wounded wolf dog overcome a forest of predators to save the soul of his master? Or will the Montana wilderness swallow the last of the elite dog warriors? Stay with us to witness a bond that defies the grave. Please support our journey by subscribing to the channel. Chapter 1. The Breathing Ice. The wind did not merely blow across the Montana wilderness. It screamed. It was a jagged and relentless force that turned the night into a wall of swirling white glass. Inside his small cabin, Silas tightened the straps of his olive-green canvas tactical jacket. He was a man built of grit and old memories, standing tall despite the weight of his late 70s. His movements were slow but deliberate. He reached for his black thermal beanie and pulled it low over his ears. Around his waist, a professional climbing harness remained buckled. It was a strange garment for a man at home, but in a storm like this, the harness was his lifeline. One mistake in the snow could mean a long fall into the darkness. Silas stepped toward the heavy oak door. He needed to check the external gas tank before the lines froze completely. As he opened the door, the blizzard punched its way inside. The heat of the hearth was swallowed instantly by the mountain air. Silas stepped out into the waist-deep drifts. Every breath felt like swallowing needles. He moved toward the side of the house, his mountaineering boots crunching through the frozen crust of the snow. Suddenly, his heavy boot caught on something solid, something that did not feel like wood or stone. Silas stumbled, his heart hammering against his ribs. He regained his balance and looked down into the hollow near the foundation of the house. At first he thought it was a fallen branch covered in frost. Then he saw the silver fur. It was a dog, or perhaps a wolf. The creature was massive, a wolf-dog hybrid with a frame that commanded respect even in its fallen state. His fur was a tapestry of charcoal and silver, though most of it was now matted with ice and gray ash from the nearby chimney vent. Silas knelt down. The old man winced as the cold bit into his joints. He reached out a gloved hand to touch the animal. The muzzle of the beast was almost entirely white. It was the mark of a long and difficult life. The creature wore an ancient, dark leather collar. The leather was cracked and brittle from years of exposure. A tarnished brass circular tag dangled from the buckle, though the engraving was obscured by a thin layer of ice. The animal did not move. Silas felt a hollow ache in his chest. He assumed the majestic creature had finally succumbed to the Montana winter. But then he noticed the posture. The wolf dog was not merely lying there. He was curled into a tight defensive spiral. His massive head was tucked inward. His heavy tail was wrapped firmly around his midsection. He was acting as a living shield. Silas leaned closer and brushed away a layer of fresh powder. Underneath the charcoal fur, a small patch of movement caught his eye. A tiny puppy was nestled deep within the heat of the older dog's belly. The pup was a miniature version of the giant with a small white spot on its forehead. It was a miracle of biology. The old wolf dog was using his final sparks of metabolic heat to keep the small heart beating. The giant's breathing was so shallow it was almost invisible. Only a faint puff of steam escaped his nose every few seconds. Silas stared at them. He looked at his own trembling hands. He thought of the warmth of his cabin. He thought of the quiet peace he had cultivated since his wife had passed away. Bringing these two inside meant noise. It meant responsibility. It meant the potential for more grief if they did not survive the night. He was tired. His bones ached. He wondered if he truly had the strength to play nursemaid to a dying predator and its offspring. For a moment, Silas considered turning back. He considered finishing his work and retreating to his chair by the fire. Then the puppy shifted. The small creature let out a high-pitched yelp that was nearly drowned out by the wind. It was a cry for help that Silas had heard many times before, in the jungles, in the mountains. It was the sound of a comrade who could no longer stand on their own. The veteran within him woke up. He reached down and patted the frozen flank of the silver wolf dog. "No one gets left behind tonight," Silas whispered. His voice was gravelly and firm. "Not on my watch." Silas turned and struggled back to the porch. He grabbed a heavy weather-worn tarp from the woodpile. He returned to the hollow and spread the tarp out on the ice. With a grunt of pure exertion, he began the grueling task of moving the animals. The wolf dog was heavy. He was a solid mass of muscle and bone. Silas gripped the animal by the shoulders and slid him onto the tarp. The old dog did not growl. He did not snap. He was too far gone for aggression. He simply looked at Silas with one cloudy amber eye. It was a look of total surrender. Silas gripped the edge of the tarp. He dug his boots into the frozen earth. He pulled. The friction of the snow resisted him. The wind tried to push him back. Silas gritted his teeth. He felt a sharp pull in his lower back, but he did not stop. He dragged the tarp toward the door inch by agonizing inch. The puppy whined again. "Hang on, little one," Silas muttered. "We are almost home." He reached the threshold of the cabin. He gave one final desperate heave. The tarp slid across the wooden floorboards. Silas slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the crackle of the fireplace and the heavy, ragged breathing of the old man. He stood there for a long time watching the ice melt off the silver fur. The charcoal coat began to steam in the warmth of the room. Silas knelt beside the wolf dog. He carefully reached into the warm pocket of fur and lifted the puppy. The small creature was shivering violently. Silas tucked the pup inside his own tactical jacket right against his chest. The warmth of the house was a sanctuary. But the battle for their lives was only just beginning. Chapter 2. Relics and Destiny. The interior of the cabin felt heavy with the smell of melting ice and wet fur. Silas stood in the center of the room. His chest heaved with the effort of the rescue. On the floor, the massive wolf dog lay motionless on the tarp. The silver and charcoal coat was steaming as the warmth of the hearth began to win the battle against the Montana frost. Silas knelt down slowly. His knees protested with a dull ache. He reached into the front of his olive-green tactical jacket. He gently pulled out the puppy. The small creature was still shivering, but its breathing had become deeper and more rhythmic against his chest. Silas placed the pup on a dry wool blanket near the fire. Then he turned his attention back to the giant. The wolf dog had not opened his eyes. His muzzle, almost entirely white with the passage of many winters, was pressed firmly against the wooden floor. Silas noticed something strange. The dog's jaws were locked shut. He was clenching something tightly. It was a small, dark object. It looked like a piece of refuse or a clump of frozen earth. Silas reached out and touched the dog's snout. He spoke in a low, calming tone. "Easy now, big fella. You are safe. You can let go." He gently worked his fingers between the dog's teeth. The animal gave a soft, weary moan. The sound of a long, exhaled breath filled the quiet room. The jaws loosened. The object fell onto the tarp with a soft, muffled sound. Silas picked it up. He held it close to the lantern light. His heart stopped. The object was not dirt. It was not a stone. It was an old wool glove. It was a deep shade of burgundy, now faded and worn thin. The edges of the cuff were frayed. Silas knew this glove. He knew the exact pattern of the knit. It belonged to his wife. She had lost it years ago. He remembered her searching for it before the first snow of a forgotten season. They had walked the perimeter of the ranch for hours, but the glove had vanished into the tall grass. Now here it was. It was soaked with the saliva and melted ice of a wandering wolf dog. Silas felt a surge of heat behind his eyes. The dog had not stumbled upon his cabin by accident. He looked at Sable. The old dog remained still, but his ears twitched at the sound of Silas's heavy breathing. Silas realized the truth. This animal had found that glove in the wild. Perhaps it was buried in a hollow log or hidden under a rock ledge. The glove still carried the faint, lingering scent of the only woman who had ever made this ranch feel like a home. The scent of kindness. Sable had tracked that scent through the blinding white wall of the blizzard. He had carried that relic across miles of frozen terrain, using it as a compass to find the one place where that smell belonged. He was not just looking for shelter. He was bringing a piece of the past back to its owner. Silas gripped the wet wool tightly in his fist. He looked down at the dog's neck. He reached for the ancient, cracked, dark leather collar. The leather felt like dry bark under his fingers. He wiped away the frost from the tarnished brass circular tag. The metal was scratched and dull. Silas leaned in. He used the sleeve of his jacket to polish the surface. There were letters engraved there. They were faint, but they were visible. The tag did not have a phone number. It did not have an address. It simply had a name and a rank from a time long gone. It was the mark of a warrior. This dog had once belonged to someone who understood duty. He had been a guardian, a protector of a different household. Now he was a drifter, a king without a kingdom. Silas felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at his own reflection in the darkened window. He saw a man who had spent years guarding his own heart against the world. He saw a man who had chosen silence over the pain of remembering. He picked up a warm, damp cloth. He began to clean the charcoal fur. He worked slowly. He wiped away the gray ash from the chimney vent that had settled on the dog's back. He brushed away the matted ice from the silver flanks. As he worked, the dog's tail made a single weak movement. It was a faint thud against the tarp. It was a gesture of recognition. Two lonely souls were meeting in the middle of a storm. One was a man who had forgotten how to hope. The other was a beast who had refused to die. Silas looked from the burgundy glove to the sleeping puppy, and then back to the white muzzle of the giant. The logic of the world suggested this was mere coincidence. But Silas no longer believed in coincidences. He felt a strange, quiet warmth spreading through his chest. It was a feeling he had not known since the day he buried his wife. He looked toward the ceiling. He wondered if she was watching. He wondered if she had looked down at this struggling creature in the forest and whispered a direction. He believed she had. She knew Silas was fading. She knew the silence of the cabin was becoming a tomb. She had sent him a mission. She had sent him a reason to wake up tomorrow. She had sent him a family of warriors to match his own. Silas set the glove down on the table. He touched it one last time with his scarred wrist. He turned back to the fireplace. He added a fresh log to the embers. The wood caught fire with a sharp sound that echoed off the timber walls. The orange light danced across the room. It touched the silver fur of the dog and the soft face of the puppy. Silas sat in his wooden chair. He did not turn off the lamp. He watched over them. He watched the rise and fall of Sable's chest. He watched the small ears of Lucky twitch in a dream. The storm continued to howl against the logs of the cabin, but for the first time in a very long time, the cold did not feel so heavy. Silas rested his head back and closed his eyes. He was a soldier again. He had a post to guard. He had lives to protect. And in the quiet of the night, he finally felt at peace. The destiny of the three of them was now woven together like the wool of the burgundy glove. One story was ending, but a much greater one was beginning. Chapter 3. The Silent Treaty. The orange glow of the fireplace flickered against the heavy timber walls of the cabin. Outside, the Montana wind continued its relentless assault. It pressed against the logs with a low and mourning groan. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine wood and the metallic tang of old climbing gear. On the thick tarp near the center of the room, the massive silver and charcoal frame of the wolf dog began to stir. Sable was returning to the world of the living. His first movement was a sudden and violent shiver that rippled through his entire body. Then his eyes snapped open. They were the color of aged amber clouded by exhaustion, but instantly sharpened by a primal instinct. Sable immediately tried to rise. His legs weakened by the freezing night, and the trauma of the storm buckled beneath his weight. He collapsed back onto the tarp, but his spirit remained unbroken. As Silas moved slightly in his wooden chair, a low and vibrating rumble began to rise from the dog's throat. It was a sound of warning. It was the sound of a protector who had nothing left but his teeth and his will. Sable bared his white fangs. His dark muzzle wrinkled with the effort of defiance. He was trembling. Every muscle in his ancient body was fighting a battle against his own frailty. He positioned his heavy head over the small puppy Lucky, who was still tucked deep into the wool blankets. Sable was ready to die to protect that small life. Silas did not stand up. He did not raise his voice. He knew that any sudden movement would be seen as an act of war. He knew the language of the broken and the defensive. Instead, Silas reached down and picked up his professional climbing harness from the floor. He began to fiddle with the equipment. He clicked the heavy metal carabiners together. The sound of metal striking metal was sharp but rhythmic. He pulled the thick nylon straps through the buckles, creating a soft and repetitive sliding noise. It was the sound of work. It was the sound of a routine. Silas kept his head down. He did not look the wolf dog in the eye. In the wild, a stare was a challenge. Silas chose to offer peace through indifference. He began to speak. His voice was low and gravelly like stones grinding at the bottom of a riverbed. "I remember a climb many years ago," Silas murmured to the metal in his hands. "The wind was just as angry as it is tonight. My partner and I were hanging off a granite face in the Bitterroot Mountains." Sable's growl did not stop, but the pitch began to change. The dog's ears twitched. He was listening to the cadence of the old man's voice. Silas continued his story. He spoke of the cold. He spoke of the way the ropes felt when they were coated in ice. He moved on to other memories. He spoke of the heat of the jungle during his younger years of service. He spoke of the brothers he had lost and the promises he had kept. He spoke of his wife and the way she used to hum while she tended to the spring garden. The cabin was filled with the history of a lonely man. The words were not meant for a dog to understand, but the intent was clear. Silas was showing the beast that he was a man of patterns. He was a man of duty. Gradually, the low rumble in Sable's throat faded away. The wolf dog lowered his head. He was still watching Silas with intense suspicion, but the bared fangs were now hidden behind his dark lips. Silas set the harness aside. He moved toward the small stove in the kitchen area. He moved with a slow and rhythmic limp. He took a heavy ceramic bowl and filled it with warm beef broth. The steam rose in soft white clouds. He walked back toward the tarp, but stopped several feet away. He placed the bowl on the floor. Then Silas backed away. He retreated all the way to his wooden chair in the corner and sat down. "You need your strength, soldier," Silas said softly. "The pup needs you to be strong." Sable waited. He looked at the bowl. He looked at Silas. The smell of the warm broth drifted across the room, calling to his starving body. Finally, the old dog dragged himself forward. His front paws slid across the tarp. He reached the bowl and began to lap at the liquid with a steady rhythm. The sound of his tongue against the ceramic was the only noise in the cabin. Silas watched him from the shadows. He felt a strange sense of respect for the creature. Sable was not eating out of greed. He was fueling his body so he could continue his watch. When the bowl was empty, Sable did not return to his defensive posture. He sat up. He looked directly at Silas. There was a moment of profound silence. It was the silence of two veterans recognizing one another across a field of pain. Silas stood up slowly. He pointed toward the stone hearth, where the fire was burning brightest. "The floor is cold over there by the door," Silas said, "but the stones by the fire stay warm all night." Silas walked over to the puppy. Lucky was starting to whimper in his sleep. The blankets were no longer enough to keep the chill of the floor away from his small frame. Silas reached down. He paused. He waited for the growl. He waited for the flash of teeth. Sable watched his hand. The dog's body was tense, but he remained still. Silas gently lifted the puppy. Lucky was a small and warm weight in his palms. Silas carried the pup to the stone hearth and laid him down on a thick sheepskin rug. Then he looked back at Sable. The old wolf dog rose to his feet. He was shaky, but he stood. He walked across the room. He moved with a heavy and dignified gait. Sable reached the hearth. He looked at the puppy. Then he looked at Silas. Sable let out a long sigh. It was a sound of absolute exhaustion and newfound trust. The massive dog lay down on the rug. He curled his charcoal and silver body around the pup. He rested his white muzzle on his paws and closed his eyes. Silas sat back down in his chair. The first treaty had been signed. It was not a treaty of words. It was a treaty of shared warmth and mutual survival. The storm continued to lash against the cabin logs. The wind rattled the window panes, but inside the fire burned steady. Silas picked up his climbing harness again. He began to clean the metal clips with a soft cloth. He felt a peace that he could not explain. He was no longer alone in the dark. He had a pack. He had a purpose. And as the night moved toward its coldest depth, Silas knew that they would face it together. The old man and the old dog, two warriors who had found a reason to stay in the fight. Chapter 4. Thawing the Frozen Soul. The morning sun reflected off the fresh Montana snow with a brightness that felt like a new beginning. Inside the cabin, the air was warm and smelled of pine wood and brewing coffee. Silas sat at his heavy oak table. He watched the shadows of the pine trees dance across the floorboards. Nearby, a small and furry hurricane was gaining momentum. Lucky had fully recovered from the freezing night. The puppy was no longer a shivering ball of fur. He was now a concentrated burst of energy. His small paws skidded across the smooth wood as he chased his own tail. Silas took a slow sip of his coffee. He felt a strange lightness in his chest. Suddenly, Lucky stopped. The pup tilted his head. His dark eyes fixed on a target near the door. It was Silas's heavy leather mountaineering boots. The boots were built for rugged terrain. They were thick and dark, and carried the scent of the deep woods. Lucky lunged forward. He grabbed the long leather lace of the right boot with his tiny teeth. He began to growl with a high-pitched and comical intensity. He shook his head back and forth, trying to kill the giant leather intruder. Silas watched with a raised eyebrow. Lucky began to backtrack. He was straining with all his might, pulling the heavy boot across the floor. The leather made a soft sliding sound against the wood. The puppy was determined. He dragged the boot toward the dark space beneath the kitchen hutch. It was his secret base. Silas watched the pup disappear into the shadows, leaving only a small tail wagging furiously behind. Then the second boot began to move. Lucky had returned for the set. Silas felt a sudden and sharp sensation in his throat. It started as a low rumble. Then it broke free. Silas laughed. The sound was deep and gravelly. It was a sound that had been absent from this house for far too many years. It was a sound that shattered the heavy and suffocating silence of his morning. The laughter echoed off the timber walls. It filled the corners where the shadows of loneliness used to hide. Silas leaned back in his chair. He wiped a small tear from the corner of his eye. "You little thief," Silas said. His voice was no longer just a rasp. It carried a hint of melody. In the center of the room, Sable was watching. The massive wolf dog was lying on the sheepskin rug. His charcoal and silver fur looked healthy in the morning light. Sable had been observing Silas for a long time. He saw the way the old man's shoulders had finally dropped. He saw the way the tension had left the scarred skin around Silas's eyes. Sable rose to his feet. He moved with a slow and dignified grace. He did not rush. The old dog walked over to the table where Silas sat. He stood there for a moment, his amber eyes locked onto the man's face. Then Sable leaned forward. He gently rested his white muzzle on Silas's weathered hand. The contact was warm. It was steady. Silas froze. He looked down at the massive head of the creature. He felt the coarse fur against his skin. He felt the weight of the dog's trust. Silas turned his hand over and began to scratch behind Sable's ears. "You saw that, didn't you?" Silas whispered. "He's going to be a handful." Sable let out a soft and deep sigh. He leaned his weight against Silas's leg. It was more than just a physical gesture. It was a profound moment of understanding. Silas realized that Sable was not just an animal he had rescued. He was a witness. He was a calm companion who looked into Silas's soul and saw the unspoken sorrow that had been buried there. Sable did not judge the grief. He simply stood beside it. He offered a silent partnership that required no explanations. Silas looked around his cabin. For the first time since the funeral of his wife, the house did not feel empty. It felt occupied. It felt alive. He looked at the pup peeking out from under the hutch. He looked at the wolf dog leaning against his knee. He felt the old instincts of his youth returning. He was a man who functioned best when he had a team. He needed others to watch his back so that he could watch theirs. Silas stood up. He walked over to the wall where a small chalkboard hung. He picked up a piece of white chalk. He did not write a grocery list. He wrote 3 names in a vertical line. Silas, Sable, Lucky. He circled the names together with a single bold line. "All right," Silas said firmly. He turned back to the dogs. "Listen up, squad mates. We have a lot of work to do before the next storm hits." Sable let out a short and sharp sound of agreement. Lucky scrambled out from under the hutch, leaving the boots behind to join the meeting. The puppy sat down and looked up at Silas with his tongue hanging out. Silas felt a sense of purpose that he thought had died a long time ago. He was no longer just a man waiting for the end of his days. He was the leader of a pack, He was a guardian of his new family. A familial bond had been forged in the fire of the blizzard and tempered in the warmth of the morning. Silas grabbed his olive-green tactical jacket from the hook. He felt stronger. He felt younger. The frozen soul of the Q bin had finally begun to melt. He opened the door to the porch. The air was cold, but it felt refreshing. "Come on," Silas called out. "Let's go see what the mountain has for us today." Sable led the way, his silver tail held high. Lucky tumbled through the snow behind him, barking at the low-hanging pine branches. Silas followed them, stepping firmly into the white landscape. The silence of the ranch was gone. In its place was the sound of life. And for Silas, that was the greatest victory of all. Chapter 5. Nightmares and Soul Rescue. The peace of the morning was a fragile thing. By the late afternoon, the Montana sky had bruised into a deep and sickly purple. The air grew heavy. Static began to crackle against the window panes. Silas stood by the kitchen counter. He was preparing a simple meal of broth and bread. Sable lay near the hearth. His silver and charcoal fur moved rhythmically with his deep breaths. Lucky was fast asleep on the sheepskin rug. Outside, the wind began to rise. It was not a steady blow, but a series of violent gusts that shook the heavy logs of the cabin. Then the world turned white. A blinding flash of lightning ripped through the blizzard. It was followed immediately by a sound that defied the laws of winter. A booming roar of thunder exploded directly over the ranch. In the high mountains, thunder snow was a rare and terrifying phenomenon. The sound did not roll like a summer storm. It struck with a sharp and violent force. To Silas, the sound was not thunder. It was the roar of a heavy artillery battery. It was the percussion of a 1,000-pound bomb hitting the earth nearby. The ceramic bowl in Silas's hands slipped. The sound of the bowl shattering against the floorboards was lost in the next explosion of thunder. Silas did not see the kitchen anymore. He did not see the warm glow of the fire. The smell of pine wood was replaced by the acrid stench of burning fuel and wet earth. He was back in the height of the conflict from his youth. He was back in the mud. He was back in the screaming chaos of a jungle clearing under heavy fire. Silas felt his knees buckle. He collapsed to the floor. His breath came in short and ragged gasps. He gripped the collar of his olive-green canvas tactical jacket with white knuckles. He was trying to pull the fabric over his head. He was trying to find a helmet that was no longer there. "Get down," he whispered into the darkness. His voice was a hollow rasp of terror. "Incoming. Stay down." Another flash of blue light illuminated the room. The thunder that followed shook the very foundation of the cabin. Silas pressed his forehead against the cold wood of the floor. He was lost in the storm of his own mind. He was a young man again, surrounded by the ghosts of comrades who had never come home. The weight of the trauma was a physical hand pressing him down into the dirt. But amidst the internal screaming, something moved. Sable had risen from the hearth. The massive wolf dog did not flinch at the lightning. He did not hide from the booming sky. He had seen fire before. He had heard the sounds of violence in his own long life. Sable walked across the room. He moved with a steady and purposeful gait. He did not bark. He did not whine. He saw the man he loved breaking into pieces on the floor. Sable reached Silas. The dog did not simply stand by. He pushed his massive head under Silas's trembling arm. He forced his way into the man's personal space. Sable pressed the full weight of his silver and charcoal body against Silas's side. He leaned into the old man with a crushing and grounding force. Silas felt the pressure. He felt the coarse and thick fur against his neck. Through the thin layers of his tactical jacket, he felt something else. It was a heartbeat. It was slow. It was steady. It was incredibly powerful. Sable's heart was a drum that beat in defiance of the thunder. Silas's fingers moved. Instead of gripping his jacket, they buried themselves deep into the dog's charcoal fur. The warmth was a tether. The smell of the dog, a scent of wild earth and wood smoke, began to pull Silas back. He felt the wet nose of the wolf dog against his ear. Sable let out a long and deep breath. It was a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world away. Slowly the jungle began to fade. The sounds of artillery turned back into the sounds of a mountain storm. The mud became the wooden floorboards of his home. Silas opened his eyes. He saw the white muzzle of the giant leaning over him. He saw the amber eyes of a creature that was not afraid of the dark. Silas let out a sob. It was a sound of pure relief. He reached up with his scarred wrist and wrapped his arm around Sable's neck. "You stayed," Silas choked out. "You didn't run." Sable remained perfectly still. He acted as a living anchor in the middle of the psychic gale. The thunder continued to boom outside. The lightning continued to dance across the snow. But Silas was no longer alone in those distant memories. He was in the present. He was safe. He realized that Sable had not just been looking for a master when he came to this cabin. The dog had been looking for a mission. Sable had sensed the fractured soul within the man from the very first night. He had chosen to become Silas's spiritual protector. He was a guardian who did not watch the doors, but watched the shadows within the heart. Silas sat up slowly. He kept his hand on Sable's shoulder. The wolf dog leaned in even closer, refusing to let the contact break. Lucky had woken up. The puppy walked over and licked Silas's hand. Silas looked at the two of them. The storm was still raging, but the cabin felt like a fortress. He reached out and pulled the puppy into his lap. He sat there on the floor, leaning against the massive frame of the wolf dog. "I've got you," Silas whispered. "And you've got me." The thunder began to move off into the distance. The flashes of light became softer. Silas felt the tension draining out of his muscles. He felt a deep and weary peace. He knew the nightmares would come again. They always did. But for the first time in his life, he had a sentinel. He had a warrior who knew the language of silence and the power of presence. Silas closed his eyes and rested his head against Sable's back. The heartbeat of the dog was the only clock that mattered now. And as the snow continued to fall, the soul of the old veteran was finally at rest. The rescue was no longer one-sided. The man had saved the dog from the ice, but the dog had saved the man from the fire of his own past. They sat together in the flickering light of the hearth, a pack of survivors, a family of warriors, united against the storm. Chapter 6. Shadows from the Valley. The storm had passed, but the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was a heavy and predatory quiet that hung over the Montana Valley. The moon was a sharp silver sliver in the sky. It cast a cold light over the frozen waves of snow. Inside the cabin, the embers of the fire were glowing a deep and rhythmic orange. Silas was sitting at the oak table. He was cleaning the lenses of his binoculars. Sable was not sleeping tonight. The massive wolf dog was standing by the heavy timber door. His charcoal and silver fur was bristling along his spine. His white muzzle was held low to the floorboards. He was scenting the air that seeped through the cracks of the threshold. Suddenly a sound drifted in from the darkness. It began as a thin and high-pitched yip. Then it grew into a chorus of jagged and hungry howls. The sound echoed off the mountain walls, making it impossible to tell exactly how many voices were joining in. It was a pack of coyotes. They were the shadows of the valley. Driven by weeks of bitter cold and empty stomachs, they had grown bold. They were no longer staying in the tree line. Silas heard the crunch of frozen snow just outside the porch. The sound was light. It was the movement of many padded feet circling the cabin. Silas stood up slowly. He walked to the corner and retrieved his hunting rifle. He worked the bolt of the weapon. The sound of the heavy metal sliding into place was sharp and mechanical. He checked the magazine. He ensured a round was seated in the chamber. Silas was a man of peace, but he was also a man who understood the laws of the wilderness. He looked at Sable. The dog had not moved from his post. His amber eyes were cold. They were fixed on the door with a terrifying intensity. Sable's body was coiled like a heavy steel spring. A low and vibrating rumble started deep in his chest. It was not a growl of fear. It was a promise of violence. Lucky the puppy had scurried under the kitchen hutch. He was small, but he knew the smell of danger. Silas walked to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain just an inch. In the pale moonlight, he saw them. Yellow eyes flashed in the dark. 6 or perhaps 7 shapes were moving through the drifts. They were thin and ragged. Their ribs were visible even through their winter coats. They were desperate, and desperation made them dangerous. One of the coyotes stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under the weight. Sable reacted instantly. He did not bark. A bark was for a pet. Instead, he let out a roar that seemed to shake the window panes. It was a deep and thunderous sound that carried the weight of his wolf heritage. It was a warning to every predator in the valley that this territory was occupied. The scratching at the door stopped immediately. Silas stood beside the dog. He rested his hand on the ancient leather collar of the giant. "I am right here with you," Silas whispered. The two of them stood there in the shadows, the veteran man and the veteran dog. They were sharing the watch. They were defending their base. Silas felt a strange and powerful surge of confidence. For years he had faced the threats of the mountain alone. He had sat through long nights with his rifle listening to the wind and wondering if he had the strength to hold the line for one more season, but tonight was different. He looked down at the massive silver shoulders of his companion. He realized he was no longer a solitary target. He was part of a unit. The coyotes outside continued to howl. They circled the cabin again and again. They could smell the puppy inside. They could smell the heat of the fire. But they could also smell the presence of a much larger predator. They could sense the ancient and lethal power of the wolf dog. Sable moved to the side window. He followed the movement of the pack with a predatory focus. Every time a coyote drew too close to the glass, Sable would show his fangs. The low rumble in his throat never stopped. Hours passed in the frozen darkness. Silas did not return to his chair. He remained standing. He kept his rifle ready. He and Sable moved in a silent and coordinated dance. When Silas checked the front, Sable watched the back. When Sable moved to the porch door, Silas covered the kitchen window. It was the instinct of the squad. It was a bond forged in the shadow of a common enemy. As the first hint of gray light began to touch the eastern peaks, the pack finally gave up. The hunger was great, but the risk was greater. The coyotes realized that this cabin was not a place of easy prey. It was a fortress guarded by 2 warriors who were ready to fight to the death. One by one, the yellow eyes faded back into the pine trees. The crunching of snow grew distant. The howls moved further down the valley until they were swallowed by the wind. The danger had passed. Sable waited for several minutes after the last scent had vanished. Then he finally relaxed his stance. He let out a long breath and looked up at Silas. The old man lowered his rifle. He engaged the safety and leaned the weapon against the wall. Silas felt a deep and weary satisfaction. He reached down and scratched Sable behind his notched ear. "Good work, soldier," Silas said. His voice was thick with emotion. "We held the line." Sable leaned his heavy head against Silas's leg. He was tired, but he was proud. Lucky peeked out from under the hutch. The puppy ran over and began to bounce around Sable's legs, sensing that the monsters were gone. Silas walked to the stove and began to stoke the fire for the morning. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He looked at the dog. Sable was already lying down, but his eyes were still scanning the room. Silas realized that his sense of security had fundamentally changed. The walls of the cabin felt thicker. The locks on the doors felt stronger. The fear of the wilderness had been replaced by the strength of the pack. He was no longer fighting the battle for survival in a vacuum. He had a partner. He had a guardian who would never sleep while Silas was in danger. And Silas knew that he would do the same for the dog. They were no longer just a man and an animal. They were a family. They were the elite dog warriors of the Montana Heights, and together they were untouchable. Silas sat in his chair and watched the sun rise over the valley. The shadows were gone, and for the first time in many years, the future did not look so dark. Chapter 7. The Ravine Accident. The sky over the Montana range had turned the color of a bruised plum. A fresh layer of powder had fallen during the night. It covered the jagged scars of the landscape in a deceptive and beautiful white blanket. Silas stood near the western edge of his property. He was dressed in his heavy olive-green canvas tactical jacket. The weight of his tools pulled at his weary shoulders. He had a mission today. The previous storm had weakened the perimeter fence near the steep ridge. It was a dangerous spot. The work could not wait. Before leaving the cabin, Silas had looked down at Lucky. The puppy was shivering despite the warmth of the hearth. Silas did not want to leave the small creature alone in the cold cabin. He reached down and lifted Lucky. He gently tucked the pup into the oversized chest pocket of his tactical jacket. The puppy let out a soft and muffled sound of contentment. He felt the warmth of Silas's body through the thick fabric. "You stay quiet in there, little soldier," Silas whispered. He patted the pocket and began his trek into the deep snow. Sable followed closely behind. The massive wolf dog moved with a rhythmic and predatory grace. His silver and charcoal fur stood out against the blinding white of the drifts. The air was bitterly cold. It felt like a physical weight pressing against the old man's lungs. Silas reached the fence line. A massive pine timber laden with hundreds of pounds of frozen snow had fallen across the wire. The wood was old. It was brittle from decades of mountain winters. Silas set his tools down. He began to clear the ice away with a heavy iron pry bar. The work was grueling. His breath came in thick white clouds that froze in his beard. He positioned himself near the edge of a narrow ravine to gain better leverage on the fallen timber. Suddenly, a sound like a gunshot echoed through the valley. It was the sound of the frozen timber snapping under the extreme pressure of the snow. The heavy wood did not simply break. It exploded downward. Silas tried to jump back, but the ground beneath his mountaineering boots gave way. The icy ledge crumbled into nothingness. The timber struck his right leg with a sickening and heavy force. Silas was thrown backward into the darkness of the ravine. He tumbled down the steep embankment. Rocks and frozen dirt tore at his olive-green jacket. He finally came to a stop at the bottom of the narrow gap. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas lay in the snow. His head was spinning. The pain in his leg was a white-hot flame that seemed to consume his entire lower body. He tried to move, but the heavy timber had followed him down. It was pinning his leg against a jagged shelf of granite. His first thought was not for himself. He reached his left hand toward his chest pocket. He felt the small and rapid heartbeat of the puppy. Lucky was trapped, but unhurt. The little dog was whimpering in terror. Silas pressed his palm against the fabric. He was shielding the pup from the crushing weight of the snow and the biting wind. "I've got you!" Silas gasped. His voice was a broken rasp. He looked up at the rim of the ravine. It was 20 feet above him. Sable was up there. The wolf dog was pacing the edge of the cliff. He was letting out a series of deep and frantic howls that echoed off the stone walls. "Stay back, Sable!" Silas shouted. The effort of the scream made his vision go dark for a moment. The cold began to settle into his bones. The sun was dropping behind the peaks. The temperature in the ravine began its rapid descent toward 20 degrees below zero. Silas used his free hand to claw at the frozen rocks. He tried to pull himself upward, but the timber was too heavy. The ice was too slick. He was trapped in a stone grave. Hours seemed to pass in the twilight. The pain in his leg began to fade into a dull and heavy ache. This was the danger. This was the sign of the frost taking hold of his blood. He looked at his fingers. They were the color of blue glass. He could no longer feel the texture of the rocks beneath his nails. A deadly and seductive drowsiness began to wash over him. The snow felt soft. It felt like a warm bed. He wanted to close his eyes and let the silence take him. He thought of his wife. He thought of the years of loneliness he had endured. Maybe it was time to stop fighting. But then he felt the puppy move against his chest. Lucky was licking Silas's chin. His tiny tongue was a desperate spark of warmth. Silas opened his eyes. He could see the stars beginning to appear through the narrow slit of the ravine. He was losing the battle. His mind began to drift. He was no longer in the present moment. He was back on a summer evening long ago. He was standing on the porch of the cabin. His wife was beside him. She was laughing. She put 2 fingers to her lips and produced a specific melody. It was a rising and falling whistle. It was the sound she used to call the dogs home from the woods. It was the sound of a family coming together. In the frozen darkness of the ravine, Silas's lips began to move. He did not have the strength to shout. He did not have the air to call for Sable. But the melody was there. It was etched into his soul. Silas subconsciously began to whistle. The sound was thin. It was a high-pitched and wavering ghost of a tune. It drifted up through the cold air. It carried the weight of every memory and every promise Silas had ever made. It was his final cry for help. Above him, at the edge of the ravine, the pacing stopped. Sable froze. The wolf dog tilted his head. The silver fur on his neck bristled as the melody reached his ears. It was a sound from the ancient past. It was a sound that commanded a response. Silas felt his head drop back against the snow. The whistle faded into a soft sigh. His eyes closed. The darkness of the Montana night began to swallow the old veteran. But the melody had been cast into the wind, and the warrior on the ridge had heard the call. Chapter 8. The Battle of the Four-Legged Warrior. The silence inside the cabin was deceptive. Sable stood by the frost-covered door. His silver and charcoal fur was bristling. His ears were pitched forward, catching the subtle vibrations of the wind. He had been pacing the floor for nearly an hour. Every instinct in his ancient body told him that the unit was broken. The man was gone too long. Suddenly a sound drifted through the heavy logs of the house. It was a thin and wavering melody. It was a whistle that carried the weight of a long-forgotten history. Sable's amber eyes widened. He did not hesitate. He did not look for a door handle he could not turn. Sable lunged toward the large bay window. The sound of shattering glass exploded into the quiet room as his massive frame burst through the pane. He hit the snow on the porch in a blur of silver movement. He did not stop to look at his own bleeding shoulders. He followed the scent of the man. He followed the scent of cold metal and olive green canvas. He followed the scent of absolute terror. At the bottom of the ravine, Silas was drifting. The world had become a soft and gray haze. The cold was no longer painful. It felt like a heavy silk blanket. He was so tired. But the shadows were moving in the trees above the ridge. The coyote pack had returned. They had sensed the weakness. They had smelled the blood of the trapped man. A ragged and thin coyote stepped to the edge of the embankment. It let out a sharp and yapping howl that signaled the others to close in. The pack began to scramble down the icy slope. Silas felt the vibrations in the snow, but he could not move his head. He felt a tiny weight shifting against his chest. Lucky was trembling. The puppy let out a small and desperate cry as the first predator reached the bottom of the run. The coyote bared its yellow teeth. It prepared to lunge. Then a roar of pure fury descended from above. A massive shape blurred through the air. Sable hit the bottom of the ravine like a mountain landslide. He did not bark. He did not warn. He struck the lead coyote with the full force of his Kong-Lo weight. The sound of the impact was heavy and final. Sable stood over the fallen Silas. His white muzzle was wrinkled in a terrifying snarl. The rest of the pack hesitated. They had expected a dying man. They had not expected a guardian of the ancient bloodline. Sable lunged again. He snapped his jaws at a coyote that tried to circle around Silas's head. The sound of his teeth clicking together was like the strike of a flint. The pack attacked in unison. They were starving. They were desperate. Sable fought with a ferocity that defied his years. He was a whirlwind of charcoal and silver. A coyote bit deep into his flank. Sable did not flinch. He turned and gripped the attacker by the neck, throwing the smaller animal against the stone wall. Another predator tore at his notched ear. Blood began to stain his silver fur, turning it a dark and heavy crimson. But Sable remained a wall of flesh and bone. He stood his ground directly over Silas's chest. Every time a coyote drew near, Sable met them with a violent and punishing strike. He was protecting the man. He was protecting the pup. He was protecting the only family he had left in this world. Finally, the pack realized the cost of the kill was too high. 3 of their members lay broken in the snow. The lead coyote let out a high-pitched yelp of retreat. The shadows vanished back into the pine trees. The silence of the ravine returned. Sable stood trembling. His breathing was a series of heavy and wet gasps. The adrenaline was fading. The pain of his wounds was beginning to set in. But his mission was not over. He looked down at Silas. The man's face was the color of ash. His eyes were half closed. Sable moved. He did not lie down beside the man. He climbed directly on top of him. Sable spread his massive body across Silas's chest and stomach. He used his own internal heat to fight the frost. He was a living furnace. But he was careful. He arched his back slightly, creating a small and hollow space over Silas's pocket. He left a gap so that Lucky could still breathe the cold air. Silas felt the weight. It was a heavy and suffocating warmth. He felt the wetness of Sable's blood soaking into his olive-green jacket. "Sable," he whispered. The sound was barely a ghost of a word. Sable responded immediately. The dog began to lick Silas's face with a rough and urgent tongue. He nudged Silas's jaw with his white muzzle. He was not being gentle. He was hitting Silas with his head, forcing the old man to stay in the world of the living. Every time Silas's eyes began to roll back, Sable would let out a deep and vibrating rumble. He was a drill sergeant. He was a brother in arms. "Stay awake, Silas," the dog's actions seemed to say. "Do not close your eyes. The watch is not over." The minutes turned into hours. The moon moved slowly across the narrow strip of sky above the ravine. Sable never stopped moving. He licked. He nudged. He pressed his warmth into the man's failing heart. He ignored the cold biting into his own open wounds. He ignored the exhaustion that threatened to pull him into the dark. Suddenly, a new sound echoed from the ridge above. It was the heavy and mechanical drone of an engine. A beam of bright white light cut through the darkness. "Over here!" a human voice shouted. Sable heard the call. He gathered his remaining strength. He did not let out a weak whimper. He threw his head back and produced a howl that was so deep and resonant, it seemed to shake the stones. It was the signal. It was the sound of a survivor calling the cavalry home. Silas felt a hand on his shoulder. He saw the blurry shapes of men in orange jackets, but his eyes stayed fixed on the silver head above him. Sable stayed in place until the very last moment. He only moved when the rescuers began to lift the heavy timber from Silas's leg. The dog stepped back into the shadows of the ravine. He watched them work. He watched them wrap Silas in a heated blanket. He watched them carefully remove Lucky from the pocket. Only then did Sable's legs finally give out. He collapsed into the snow. His work was done. The unit was still whole. The promise had been kept. As the rescuers carried them up the embankment, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter over Montana. The battle was won. The four-legged warrior had held the line. Chapter 9. The Dawn of the Survivors. The morning light did not break over the Montana peaks with a roar. It arrived as a soft and hesitant glow of rose and gold. It touched the jagged edges of the ravine where the shadows of the night had finally begun to dissolve. High above the steep slope, the silence was broken by the rhythmic crunching of heavy boots against the frozen crust of the snow. Two neighbors from the valley below were moving through the trees. They were guided by a sight that chilled their hearts. Across the pristine white landscape, a jagged trail of dark crimson was etched into the snow. It was a blood trail. It was the map of a struggle that had lasted through the coldest hours of the night. The men followed the trail toward the edge of the steep embankment. Then a sound rose from the depths of the earth. It was a deep and resonant howling. It was a sound of absolute authority and desperate summons. Sable was still there. The old wolf dog was sitting upright, despite the wounds on his flanks. His silver and charcoal fur was stained with the red of his own sacrifice. But his amber eyes were fixed on the men as they scrambled down the slope with their flashlights and heated blankets. Sable did not move until the first human hand touched Silas's neck. Only when the rescuer signaled that the heartbeat was steady did the giant dog allow his head to drop. The recovery was a long and quiet process. The weeks that followed were filled with the smell of antiseptic and the sound of the wind rattling the clinic windows. The local news carried the story of the veteran and the wolf dog who had survived the impossible. People called Sable a hero. They sent bags of premium food and new leather collars to the ranch. But Sable did not care for the fame. He did not care for the polished brass or the attention of strangers. His world was contained within a single room. He spent his days lying beside Silas's bed. His white muzzle rested on the edge of the mattress. He only ate when Silas offered the food. He only slept when the rhythm of Silas's breathing told him that the man was safe. By the time the late spring sun began to melt the higher glaciers, Silas was back at the ranch. He moved with a new limp aided by a sturdy wooden cane, but his eyes were no longer hollow. The gray fog of his mourning had been replaced by a quiet and steady light. One evening, Silas walked out onto the porch. He was wearing his olive-green tactical jacket. The air was now mild and sweet with the scent of pine. He sat in his old wooden chair and leaned his cane against the railing. Sable was there instantly. The dog walked to his side and sat down with a heavy and dignified sigh. The wounds on his shoulder had healed into thick and silver scars. They were the medals of a battle won. Silas reached out and began to stroke the coarse fur of the dog's neck. "We made it big, fella," Silas said. His voice was clear. It carried the strength of a man who had found his way home. In the yard below, Lucky was engaged in a fierce battle with a dandelion. The puppy had grown larger. His movements were now a mix of clumsy enthusiasm and the burgeoning grace of his breed. He pounced on the yellow flower and let out a high-pitched sound of triumph. Silas watched the pup with a small and genuine smile. He looked at the wide expanse of the valley. He thought about the night of the storm. He thought about the moment he had found them near the gas tank, frozen and fading. He had believed he was the one doing the saving. He had thought that his strength and his cabin were the only things that mattered. But as he looked at the wolf dog beside him, Silas realized a deeper truth. He had saved their bodies from a physical death in the ice, but they had saved him from something much worse. They had saved him from the slow and silent death of his own spirit. They had pulled him out of the grave of his loneliness. They had reminded him that a warrior's life is defined by the things he protects. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out the old burgundy wool glove. It was clean now. It was mended. He held it for a moment, then tucked it back away. He no longer needed to cling to the ghosts of the past to feel his wife's presence. He could see her love in the survival of the hay creatures she had sent to his door. He looked at Sable. The dog looked back with a gaze that was ancient and knowing. They were no longer just a man and a dog living in a house. They were a unit. They were a pack. They were a family. The true elite dog warriors of the Montana wilderness. The sun began to drop behind the western ridges. It painted the sky in shades of violet and deep blue. Silas stood up and whistled. It was the same melody he had used in the ravine. Lucky stopped his play and raced up the porch steps, tumbling over his own paws. Sable rose to his feet, standing shoulder to shoulder with his master. "Time to go in," Silas said. "The night is coming, and we have the watch." They walked through the door together. The heavy oak door closed with a solid and certain sound. The lights of the cabin flickered on. It was a warm beacon in the vast darkness of the mountains. The storm was over. The survivors had found their dawn. And as the stars began to appear over the ranch, the silence was no longer heavy. It was the silence of peace. It was the silence of a home that was finally whole. In the quiet moments after the storm, we are reminded that true warriors are not those who seek out conflict, but those who stand as a shield for the fragile lives in their care. Loyalty is not just a single act, but a quiet promise that remains unbroken even through the coldest winters of the heart. If the bond between Silas and Sable touched your soul today, please consider joining our pack by subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your support through a simple like helps us bring more of these stories to life. The next journey of courage is waiting for you right now, so please click on the video appearing on your screen to see where the trail leads next. Thank you for being a part of our family here at Elite Dog Warriors.